Dr. Elena Harper was nearing the end of yet another grueling day at her private practice in New Haven. Her office was dimly lit, and the clock had long since struck 9 p.m. when her phone began buzzing insistently on the desk. She paused, her body heavy with exhaustion, tempted to ignore it. But something, perhaps intuition or a lingering sense of duty, compelled her to pick it up. "Dr. Harper speaking," she answered, her voice laced with fatigue. The reply came instantly, a man's voice, deep, urgent, almost trembling. "This is Sheriff Marcus Reynolds from Brookhaven. My daughter, Amanda, she's had a severe heart attack. The doctors here, they've told me they can't operate. They said you're the only surgeon who can save her. Please, I'm begging you." Elena straightened in her chair, her fatigue vanishing in an instant. The sheer desperation in his voice was palpable. For a man like a sheriff, accustomed to being in control, to plead this way? It spoke volumes about the gravity of the situation. "Sheriff Reynolds," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline now coursing through her veins, "I'll need more details. What exactly has the hospital done so far?" "They've stabilized her," the sheriff replied, his voice breaking under the weight of his fear. "But Amanda, she has a congenital heart defect. A septal defect, they called it. The lead doctor told me she won't survive without surgery. If you don't help her, she'll die." Elena didn't hesitate. "I'll leave immediately," she assured him. "Send me all her medical records and the hospital's address." Within minutes, she had packed her surgical tools, loaded her SUV, and was on the road. Flying wasn't an option. Brookhaven was a remote town with no late-night flights or emergency transport services. The drive would take at least 4 hours, but it was the fastest way to reach Amanda. As the quiet highway stretched out before her, Elena's mind raced. The medical records the sheriff had sent painted a grim picture. Amanda's condition, a septal defect, disrupted the heart's normal blood flow, causing life-threatening arrhythmias. Time was running out. Without immediate intervention, the damage to her heart could become irreversible. The weight of the responsibility pressed down on her like never before. Amanda was just 16, an age when life should be full of promise and possibility. And Sheriff Reynolds' trembling voice echoed in her mind. This wasn't just a plea for medical expertise, it was a father's desperate cry to save his child. As the clock on her dashboard read 2:05 a.m., the faint glow of Brookhaven's streetlights appeared on the horizon. Relief washed over her. She was so close. But that relief was fleeting. Out of nowhere, red and blue lights flared in her rearview mirror, accompanied by the piercing wail of a siren. Elena frowned, her grip tightening on the wheel as she slowed and pulled to the side of the road. She was careful to obey traffic laws, knowing the urgency of her mission. Why was she being stopped? 2 officers stepped out of the patrol car. The first, a middle-aged man with a hard expression, approached her window. The second hung back, his hand resting on the holstered weapon at his hip. "License and registration," the first officer barked. Elena complied, handing over her documents. "Officer, I don't believe I violated any traffic laws," she said calmly. "Where are you headed in such a hurry?" the officer asked, his tone laced with suspicion. "I'm Dr. Elena Harper, a heart surgeon," she explained. "I'm on my way to Brookhaven Hospital to operate on Amanda Reynolds. Sheriff Reynolds called me himself. His daughter's in critical condition." The officers exchanged a glance. To her disbelief, the second officer scoffed. "The sheriff called you?" His tone was dripping with derision. "A black woman driving a car with New Haven plates, claiming to be a surgeon? In the middle of the night? That's rich." Elena stiffened, anger flaring in her chest. She had encountered prejudice before, but never in a moment as critical as this. "If you don't believe me, call the sheriff yourself," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "But I need to get to that hospital. Every second matters." The first officer's expression hardened. "We'll decide what matters," he said coldly. "For all we know, you're smuggling something. Step out of the vehicle." Elena's heart pounded. The arrogance, the disbelief, it was suffocating. "Officers, I don't have time for this," she insisted. A 16-year-old girl's life is at stake. Watch your tone, the second officer snapped, his hand tightening on his weapon. Elena swallowed her frustration, forcing herself to stay composed. Reaching for her phone, she said, "I'm calling Sheriff Reynolds. He'll confirm everything." The first officer hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. "Go ahead. Let's see if this story of yours checks out." With trembling fingers, Elena dialed the sheriff's number, silently praying he'd pick up. The phone rang once.
Twice.
"Dr. Harper?" Sheriff Reynolds' voice was anxious, taut with worry. "Are you close?" Elena exhaled sharply, her voice shaking with restrained frustration. "Sheriff, I've been stopped by 2 officers on the highway. They don't believe me, and I'm running out of time," Elena said, her voice tight with urgency. She extended the phone toward the older officer, her hand steady despite the waves of tension radiating from him. "Sheriff Reynolds wants to speak with you."
Now?
The officer hesitated, his eyes narrowing as if searching for any sign that this might be an elaborate bluff. Seconds felt like an eternity before he finally snatched the phone from her. "Hello," he said brusquely, his tone dismissive and skeptical. Though Elena couldn't hear the sheriff's words, she could see the shift in the officer's demeanor. His shoulders straightened, his eyes widened slightly, and his expression became tinged with unease. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice losing its sharp edge. "I understand. No, sir, it won't happen again." As he ended the call, he glanced at Elena, his earlier arrogance replaced with an awkward, begrudging respect. "You can go," he said stiffly, handing the phone back to her. The younger officer, however, wasn't ready to concede. "We're just supposed to take her word for it," he muttered, his voice still laced with disdain. "Enough," the older officer barked, his authority snapping back into place. Sheriff Reynolds vouched for her. "Let her go." Elena wasted no time. Without a word, she rolled up her window, restarted her car, and sped off into the night. Her hands trembled as they gripped the wheel, frustration and relief battling for dominance within her. The encounter had cost her precious time Amanda didn't have. Finally, the hospital came into view, its fluorescent lights glowing like a beacon in the pre-dawn darkness. Elena parked hastily, grabbed her surgical bag, and rushed inside. The emergency room buzzed with activity, but one figure stood out, a tall man in a sheriff's uniform pacing anxiously near the entrance. "Dr. Harper?" Marcus Reynolds called out, striding toward her with visible relief. His face was lined with exhaustion and fear. "Thank God you're here. Amanda's in your prep room." Elena nodded, her sharp gaze scanning the hallway for directions. "Get me scrubbed in," she said, her voice clipped and professional. The urgency in her tone seemed to ground the sheriff, who immediately gestured for her to follow. "This way," he said, leading her through the labyrinth of hallways. When they reached the OR, the severity of Amanda's condition hit Elena like a punch. The young girl was pale and unresponsive, her vital signs dangerously unstable. A team of doctors and nurses surrounded her, their faces drawn with grim determination. "Elena Harper, cardiothoracic surgeon," she introduced herself while donning her surgical gown and gloves. "What's the status?" The attending physician, a young man with weary eyes, looked up from the monitor. "Ventricular fibrillation," he said. "We've defibrillated twice, but there's no sustained rhythm." Elena's chest tightened. Every second Amanda's heart remained unstable increased the likelihood of permanent damage. "Prep the bypass machine," she instructed. "We need to stabilize her and perform an emergency repair of the defect." The team sprang into action, following her directives with practiced efficiency. Despite the urgency and chaos, Elena felt a flicker of hope. She was here now, and she would give everything she had to save Amanda. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as Elena worked with unwavering focus, her hands moving with precision as she repaired the defect in Amanda's heart. The room was tense, the only sounds the steady beeping of monitors and Elena's quiet commands. But as the surgery progressed, the grim reality set in. The delays, the time lost during the drive, and the encounter with the officers had caused irreparable damage. Amanda's heart was struggling, even with the bypass machine supporting it. "Come on, Amanda," Elena murmured under her breath, her voice barely audible beneath her mask. "Stay with me." Suddenly, the monitor emitted a sharp, continuous tone. Elena's heart dropped as her eyes darted to the screen, a flat line. "No, no, no," she exclaimed, her voice breaking through the tense silence. "Start compressions. Administer another dose of epinephrine. Charge the paddles to 200. The team worked with urgency, their movements a blur of controlled chaos. But after several minutes, the attending physician placed a hand gently on Elena's arm. "Dr. Harper," he said quietly, his voice heavy with resignation. Elena froze, staring at Amanda's still, pale figure on the table. The flat line on the monitor felt like a physical blow, the weight of every lost second crashing down on her. She squeezed her eyes shut, the words catching in her throat.
I
need to call it," she said finally, her voice cracking. She glanced at the clock on the wall. Time of death, 4:07 a.m. Her hands trembled as she removed her gloves and surgical gown, her heart aching with the knowledge that she had done everything in her power, yet it hadn't been enough. In the waiting room, Sheriff Reynolds shot to his feet the moment he saw her. His face was a mixture of desperate hope and unspoken dread. "She's gone," Elena said softly, her eyes brimming with tears. "I'm so sorry." Reynolds staggered back, his expression crumpling into raw grief. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. His body shook as he buried his face in his hands, his silent sobs echoing louder than any words ever could. Reynolds buried his face in his hands, the weight of his grief nearly unbearable. But when he finally looked up, the sorrow in his eyes had transformed into a burning anger. His voice trembled with both heartbreak and fury. "What happened? You were supposed to be here in time." Elena swallowed hard, steadying herself as she met his gaze. "Sheriff, I was stopped by 2 of your officers on the highway," she said, her voice calm but firm. "They delayed me for nearly 20 minutes. The sheriff's face darkened, his sorrow boiling into uncontained rage. "They did what?" he roared, his fists clenching at his sides. Elena nodded, her own emotions tightly controlled despite the storm raging within her. "I can't undo what's happened," she said softly, "but I can help you hold them accountable. My car's camera recorded the entire encounter." Reynolds' jaw tightened, his expression hardening with resolve. "This won't go unanswered," he vowed, the words like a promise carved in stone. Without another word, he stormed out of the waiting room, leaving Elena alone with the crushing weight of the night. Sheriff Marcus Reynolds entered his office at the Brookhaven Police Department like a tempest, his every step fueled by grief and fury. His daughter Amanda was gone, taken too soon, and the thought that her life might have been saved if not for the actions of his own officers cut him to the core. "Get me Officers Grant and Miller," he barked at his deputy. The younger man blinked, startled by the sheriff's uncharacteristic tone. "Sir, they're not on duty right now." "Then call them." Reynolds snapped. "I want them here.
now."
Within the hour, Officers Grant and Miller stood before him, their postures rigid but their faces betraying unease. Grant, the older of the two, tried to maintain a stoic expression, while Miller fidgeted nervously, his earlier bravado nowhere in sight. "Explain to me," Reynolds began, his voice dangerously calm, "why you stopped Dr. Harper on the highway last night." Grant cleared his throat, trying to muster a defense. "Sheriff, we thought she looked suspicious. Late night, out-of-town plates. It raised a red flag. We were just doing our job." "Your job." Reynolds' voice rose, his anger no longer restrained. "Your job was to serve and protect, not to harass someone based on a baseless assumption." His fist slammed down on the desk, making both officers flinch. "She told you she was a surgeon. Did it ever occur to you to verify her story? To pick up your radio and call me? Instead, you wasted 20 precious minutes, time that could have saved my daughter's life." The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of Reynolds' words sinking in. Grant looked down, avoiding his gaze, while Miller's face turned pale. "Dr. Harper recorded the entire encounter," Reynolds continued, his voice low and laced with menace. "I've reviewed the footage myself. Your behavior was unprofessional, prejudiced, and completely unacceptable. Effective immediately, you are both suspended without pay, pending an internal investigation. Hand over your badges and firearms." "Sir," Grant began, but the sheriff's icy glare cut him off. "Now," Reynolds barked. Reluctantly, the two officers removed their badges and holsters, placing them on the desk. As they left the office, heads bowed, Reynolds leaned back in his chair, exhaling a long, shaky breath. The weight of his decision pressed on him, but he knew it was the right one. Later that day, Reynolds called a meeting with his senior staff and legal advisors. Grief had steeled into resolve, and he was determined to ensure that justice extended beyond his department's walls. "This has to go beyond an internal investigation," he said, his voice resolute. "I want the footage from Dr. Harper's car reviewed and preserved. Prepare a formal complaint and contact the press. I'm going public with this." The room buzzed with murmurs, some of agreement, others of hesitation. Lieutenant Helen Carter, a seasoned officer, raised her voice above the chatter. "Marcus, are you sure about this? Taking this public could cause backlash against the department, against you." Reynolds met her gaze, his expression unyielding. "I've already lost my daughter. I won't lose my integrity. If the public loses faith in us because we failed to hold our own accountable, then we've already failed as an institution." His words left the room in stunned silence. One by one, heads nodded in agreement, a shared understanding passing through the team. By the next morning, the story had spread like wildfire. Local news outlets ran headlines detailing Sheriff Reynolds' bold decision to suspend two officers for racial profiling and dereliction of duty. Dr. Harper's dashcam footage, released with her consent, sparked outrage across the Brookhaven community. That evening, hundreds of residents gathered outside the police station for a candlelight vigil in Amanda's honor. The crowd, united in grief and determination, held signs reading "Justice for Amanda" and "End Racial Profiling." Dr. Elena Harper stood among them, her presence a powerful symbol of both personal loss and systemic injustice. When the crowd urged her to speak, she hesitated, the weight of the night still fresh in her heart. But their encouragement gave her the strength to step forward. Taking a deep breath, she addressed the crowd. "I came to Brookhaven to save a life. I couldn't save Amanda's, and that's a burden I'll carry forever. But what happened to her? The delay, the prejudice, cannot happen again. Not here, not anywhere." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "We've lost Amanda, but we can honor her memory by demanding change, by holding those in power accountable, and by ensuring that no other family suffers the way Sheriff Reynolds has." The crowd erupted into applause, their candles held high as a promise to fight for justice. As the night wore on, the community's collective grief began to transform into hope, a hope that Amanda's story would lead to a brighter, fairer future for all. Dr. Elena Harper stood before the crowd, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "I came to Brookhaven to save a life," she began. "But I was delayed, not by distance, not by traffic, but by prejudice. That delay cost Amanda Reynolds her life." The crowd was silent, hanging on her every word. "This isn't just about me or Amanda or even Sheriff Reynolds," she continued, her tone resolute. "This is about all of us. If we don't confront injustice, we allow it to thrive. We can and must do better." Her words were met with applause and shouts of agreement, a collective call for reform that echoed through the night. The next day, Sheriff Marcus Reynolds stood before the press outside the Brookhaven Police Department. His uniform was immaculate, his face solemn, but his voice carried the strength of conviction. "We, as law enforcement officers, are entrusted with the sacred duty to protect all members of our community, regardless of race, gender, or background," he began. "When we fail in that duty, we must hold ourselves accountable. The actions of Officers Grant and Miller were a betrayal of that trust, and they will face the consequences." His gaze swept across the reporters gathered before him. "This is not just about Amanda or Dr. Harper. This is about ensuring that such failures never happen again." Behind him, Dr. Harper watched, her heart heavy with grief, but also filled with hope. Reynolds' words felt like a promise, not just to her, but to the entire community. As the press conference ended, Reynolds approached Elena. His voice was quiet, almost fragile. "Thank you." "For what?" she asked, her tone laced with disbelief. "For reminding me what it means to fight for justice, even when it's hard." Elena nodded, her chest tightening with emotion. "Thank you for standing up. Amanda would be proud." In the weeks that followed Amanda's tragic death, Brookhaven became a focal point for a national conversation on racial prejudice and systemic reform. The suspension of officers Grant and Miller was only the beginning. Sheriff Reynolds, fueled by grief and a renewed sense of purpose, launched sweeping reforms within the department. Mandatory bias training for all officers, conducted by an independent organization, became a cornerstone of the changes. A civilian oversight board was established to review complaints against the police, ensuring transparency and accountability. "We're not just fixing what went wrong that night," Reynolds told his staff during a meeting. "We're building a system that ensures it doesn't happen again." While some within the department resisted, the community embraced the changes. Elena returned to her work in New Haven, but Brookhaven and Amanda's story remained with her. The events of that night played over in her mind. The flashing lights in her rearview mirror, the mocking tones of the officers, and the sterile silence of the operating room when she declared Amanda's time of death. Instead of letting those memories consume her, Elena channeled her energy into advocacy. She became a vocal supporter of police reform and spoke at medical conferences about the intersection of healthcare, race, and justice. "I couldn't save Amanda," she said during one panel discussion. "But if her story can prevent another loss, then her legacy lives on." Her bond with Sheriff Reynolds deepened over time, their shared grief forging an unexpected friendship. Through their conversations, Elena learned more about Amanda, a bright, compassionate young woman who had dreamed of becoming a doctor. "She wanted to help people like you do," Reynolds told her during one late-night phone call. His voice was heavy, but there was a trace of pride. Elena smiled softly. "Then I'll keep helping people, for her." Months turned into years, and the changes in Brookhaven began to show. Complaints of misconduct decreased, relationships between the police and the community improved, and trust was slowly rebuilt. At a town hall meeting, a mother of 2 teenage sons spoke through tears. "For the first time, I feel like my boys are seen and protected, not feared or targeted." "Thank you, Sheriff Reynolds." Humbled by the community's gratitude, Reynolds reminded them, "This is just the beginning. We have more work to do." The annual vigil for Amanda became a cherished tradition in Brookhaven, not just a time to mourn her loss, but to celebrate the change her memory inspired. Residents gathered with candles, sharing stories of how Amanda's legacy had touched their lives. On the second anniversary of her death, the town unveiled a memorial bench in the park Amanda had loved. Inscribed on the bench were the words, "In memory of Amanda Reynolds, a heart that inspired change." Elena was invited to speak at the ceremony. Standing before the crowd, she looked out at their faces, diverse, united, and filled with hope. "Amanda's heart may have failed that night, but her spirit never did," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "She brought us together. She reminded us that every life is precious, that every second counts. Let's honor her by continuing to fight for justice, fairness, and compassion." Her words were met with applause, but it was the silence that followed, a collective moment of reflection that lingered longest. As Elena drove back to New Haven that evening, she thought about how far they had all come since that fateful night. The pain of losing Amanda would never fully fade, but it had transformed into something greater, a catalyst for change, a beacon of hope. For Sheriff Marcus Reynolds, the fight continued. His department had become a model for reform, and his name was now synonymous with integrity and accountability. Yet every success was bittersweet, a reminder of the daughter he had lost and the cost of complacency. For Dr. Elena Harper, the experience deepened her resolve. She continued to save lives in the operating room while advocating for equity and justice. Her friendship with Reynolds remained a source of strength, proof that even in the face of tragedy, connection and compassion could prevail. Amanda's story had changed them all. Though her life was cut short, her impact would be felt for generations, a legacy of hope, justice, and the unwavering belief that every life matters.